4th of July weekend was always the biggest celebration in our town. Everyone would go all out for this holiday, every single year. People threw parties at home, at bars, and especially on the lakes. The usual supplies included beer, fireworks, and some random meat to toss on the grill. Everyone loved it, and it was a tradition for my family and me to head to the lake for the weekend. However, a few years ago, when I was still living at home, I couldn't go. My parents took my younger brother, but I had to stay home because I had just had my wisdom teeth removed earlier that day. Despite it being a one-day thing, the medicine and anesthesia made me feel really sick. I was bummed, but I figured there was always next year. I was wrong. That year changed the holiday for me forever. When I came home from the oral surgeon, I was groggy for the first few hours. I drifted in and out of sleep. My mom would pop in now and then to see if I needed anything, just like moms do. Before they left for the fireworks show, she made sure to give me my pain medication. I should mention I was 16 at the time, so it wasn't like she was leaving a young child at home. She just wanted to make sure I wouldn't have to move from the couch to take my meds. My dad placed the remote, a phone, and offered to grab me something soft to eat if I was hungry, which I wasn't. I really just wanted to go back to bed. When they walked out the door, they turned off the lights, leaving me with only the glow of the television. I settled in to watch some terrible B-rated horror movies or awful reality shows. Either was fine by me. I was snuggled up in a comforter on the sofa when I began to hear screaming from outside. It didn't sound like my parents, so I wasn't too concerned. I was just curious. I wasn't surprised to see an elderly man who lived diagonally from us. He was always causing some kind of trouble. This time, it seemed to be about something to do with his yard, judging by how he was drawing imaginary lines on the ground. I rolled my eyes at the annoyance. I had a run-in with him when I was 13. He got mad because I kicked a soccer ball into his yard. It didn't hit anything except his grass, but he called me every name he could think of. After that, I kept my distance. This time, the family seemed to be standing their ground. I felt a little proud of them. The husband and wife next door stood on their side of the yard, while the wife pointed angrily at the ground. I decided I'd seen enough and went back to the couch. About 45 minutes later, the pain medication started to take over. Things became a lot fuzzier, and I felt warm and sleepy. Each time I blinked, it felt like I dozed off for minutes. Finally, when the feeling wasn't so new, I adapted to it and managed to stay awake better. It was fairly dark outside by now. The clock read 8:45 p.m., which meant the fireworks show would start soon. I switched the TV to the channel that did a live broadcast of the event and parted the curtains to see the neighbors' display. It was around 9:15 when the show kicked off. The TV played music from the live band. Things were normal until I heard doors slamming repeatedly. I tried to ignore it, but the noise was frustrating. I got off the sofa and looked outside. It was still the old man. I always called him Grumps because, even after years of living there, I could never remember his name. He was walking around his truck, slamming all 4 doors. His garage door was open, and the rest of the house seemed dark. He wore khaki pants and a dark long-sleeve button-down shirt. I thought it was weird, but figured he was just going somewhere. It wasn't until nearly 30 minutes later that I realized how wrong I was. I heard sporadic noises throughout the night but didn't pay much attention until a firework exploded from the neighborhood. It wasn't the bright lights in the air that caught my eye, but an orange flash, going horizontally, scarily close to the ground. It wasn't even going towards the sky. I saw it again when the fireworks stopped. At first, I thought it was the pain medication or a glare. But as I stood motionless, transfixed on the kaleidoscope of colors outside my window, I finally understood what was happening. The old man had a gun and was using the fireworks to mask his gunshots. The only reason I realized this was when he shot out the front windows of the couple's house he had argued with earlier. Glass shattered, and it glittered. My hand flew over my mouth. When he moved as if he was going to turn my way, I hid beside the wall so he couldn't see me. From my vantage point, I saw the couple's car still parked in the driveway. My stomach sank. I grabbed my cell phone and, as I returned to the living room to call, I heard pounding on the door. I crouched. The pain medication still made my vision blurry, and my hearing felt like I was underwater, but I forced myself to focus. I stayed down and quietly made my way to another area in the house without windows. When I called 911, I barely whispered as I told them what I had seen and that the man was at my door. The operator worked to keep me calm and asked if I could see him. Stupidly, I tried to get a glimpse. If he didn't know I was home before, he knew then. We locked eyes and he waved with a sickly grin. I was sure he would shoot out my windows, but he didn't. Instead, I heard more yelling. I watched him turn and step back from the window. With the operator still on the phone, I grabbed a chair and shoved it in front of the door. I was about to close the curtains when I saw the guy from across the street on my lawn, screaming at Grumps even while he had a gun. I held my breath as another round of fireworks exploded and the orange flash returned. This time, it connected. The guy from across the street went down, clutching his knee. I was gripping the phone for dear life and begging for the cops to show up soon. I was afraid of what Grumps would do next. When the last round of fireworks went off, I thought it was too late. Then, I heard knocking again. I was sure it was him, but when they shouted police, I could have cried. I let them in, and I saw several lights flashing outside. The old man was on the ground under a pile of officers. The guy from across the street was being taken away by medics. The officer stayed with me while I called my family and waited outside until they got back. Grumps ended up leaving the neighborhood within the next year. He was charged, but I didn't keep up with the case. I just know he's not here anymore, and the neighborhood has never been happier. On July 4th, 2016, I got off work in the afternoon and decided that instead of going downtown, I would stay home and watch the fireworks from my porch. The part of town I lived in at the time was on a hill, and from my bedroom window, I could see a good portion of the city. At 9 p.m., the first few pops of the fireworks sounded off, and I scurried outside to watch. Unfortunately, what I thought would be a clear view was partially blocked by the trees lining my street. So, I decided to find another spot. My street ended at a major road in the city. If you turned left at the end of the block and walked a little, there was a Red Cross building with a large open parking lot. Perfect, I thought. I reached the Red Cross parking lot about 15 minutes into the show. I stood under a streetlight, enjoying the unobstructed view. I heard the sound of a car turning onto the road that runs parallel to this parking lot. I looked over and saw an older mid to late 90s model, Mercury or Buick of some sort, driving slowly down the road. The car skidded to a stop so abruptly that I heard the tires squealing. Before I knew it, whoever was driving was pulling into the parking lot and making a direct beeline for me. Then, they floored it. I turned and ran as fast as I could across the parking lot toward a row of houses on another street. People were out on their front porches, and I figured the car wouldn't try to snatch me if there were potential witnesses. I ran past the people and behind a road-closed sign that blocked traffic to another street behind the Red Cross building. There had been heavy construction on this road all summer. While people could drive on it, they could only get so far without running into more barriers. I looked behind me and saw the red car stop just before the barrier. The car sat for a minute, headlights shining directly at me through the large industrial sign. Just as soon as they had appeared, they did a three-point turn and disappeared into the night. My heart was pounding from the close call, but I figured I was safe now. I could still see part of the fireworks show, so I stood in the darkness of the quiet little back neighborhood and watched it. When the fireworks were over, the people on the porches went back inside, and I started to walk home. I was walking parallel to the little cemetery that sits on this back road, when again, I heard the sound of a car coming down the road. When I turned, I recognized the familiar outline of the car that had chased me earlier. I almost wet myself in fear. I ducked behind the closest house, hoping and praying that they didn't have some sort of motion-sensing security light that would give my position away, or that whoever lived there wouldn't come outside and catch me. I hid quickly enough that I hoped the car wouldn't see where I'd gone. For a minute, I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. But as they got closer, I recognized the music they had been playing when they chased me the first time. I heard the brakes squeal slightly as the car slowed down to a crawl and then stopped. The car must have sat in front of that house for about 30 seconds. Then I heard them talking, saying they needed to grab another one, or their boss would be mad. They needed to sell a few more. They needed more people. They needed more kids. Then they sped away down the road toward where the remaining construction began. The back entrance to my neighborhood was only 2 blocks away. I started running and didn't stop until I had made it safely up to my porch stairs and into my bedroom. To this day, that night scares me. Hopefully, I never see those guys again. From 2004 to 2007, my best friend Katie and I worked at a small family-owned seafood restaurant in Winchester Bay, Oregon. In 2006, we were invited by the cook and a small group of regulars to a bonfire on the bay to watch the 4th of July fireworks. Thinking it sounded fun and having no other plans, we agreed to go. When we arrived, we found the guys drinking next to a huge fire in a large clearing, surrounded by dense thickets of evergreens. There was one clearly defined trail leading through the trees to the water's edge, and a gravel parking area behind us. Since we were 20 years old and didn't know these men well, we decided to stay sober and just enjoy the fire and the fireworks. After chatting for a bit, the guys decided they wanted to smoke some weed. Katie and I said no thanks, and the boys headed off into the woods. We stood alone by the fire, enjoying the evening. Suddenly, I got a strange sensation and kept glancing at a specific area of the tree line. It was a crawling feeling that I tried to ignore, but couldn't. After a minute or two, an older woman came walking out of the trees. She wasn't on or near the trail. She had walked through the thick undergrowth in the pitch black. She was short, frail, and dressed in layers of raggedy clothes, with several shawls or blankets wrapped around her shoulders. She was hunched over and walking slowly, as if her joints were bothering her. It was twilight, so I couldn't make out her face or features, just her outfit, which was pretty creepy. Figuring she was a homeless person who deserved respect and sympathy, I tried not to stare. However, when I looked over at Katie, she was also watching the woman. The woman had an aura about her that made it hard not to watch. She gave off the feeling of a wild animal in your house, probably not too dangerous, but you keep an eye on it just in case. It was a feeling of unease that I couldn't shake. Katie turned to me and asked if I was seeing this. I replied yes, thinking she was probably just a homeless person. Katie felt that she shouldn't look away, which validated my misgivings and was not comforting. We stood in silence, watching the woman make her slow way along the tree line to our front left. I felt bad for staring and tried to rationalize my worry, thinking she was just a decrepit grandmother, even if she did look like a stereotypical witch. Suddenly, the woman came to a complete stop. Until that moment, she had been looking at the ground. She now stopped, raised her head, and looked directly at us. A feeling of dread hit me and my stomach dropped. Her look felt malevolent, even though I still couldn't make out her facial features in the dusk. Then, no joke, this woman raised her left arm and pointed straight at us, letting out the most blood-curdling screech I had ever heard. My heart stopped for a split second. I'll never forget this image. Right in front of her pointing finger, a silhouette of a human made of what looked like a black mist, a shadow person. I don't know if it just appeared or came from her body. I barely had time to register what I was seeing before the thing flew towards us. It moved so incredibly fast, covering about 300 feet in less than 3 seconds. The shadow person passed directly between me and Katie. It was on my left and her right. It literally blew my hair back over my shoulders when it rushed past. We stood in complete shock, staring at each other with pale faces. Simultaneously, we turned to look at the woman. She was no longer looking at us, but had picked up her pace and was doing a hobbling run in the direction she had originally been headed, eyes on the ground. Katie and I stood in silence, each afraid we might have just gone mad. At first, I was afraid to even ask her if she had seen that thing, but looking at her face, I knew she had seen something. She finally asked if I had seen what she did because she wasn't sure if it was real. We compared notes and realized we had both witnessed the same thing. When I started freaking out about the fact that this thing had been real enough to blow my hair back, she admitted that while she didn't experience her hair moving, she had seen my hair blow back as she turned her head to watch it go right between us. I have no idea who that woman was or what she sent after us. It looked like a shadow person, but who knows what it really was. Never in my life had I heard of a shadow person doing a living person's bidding, and I looked into this after the experience. I've never seen her again, and I surely never want to. This experience has bothered me for years, so I brought it to the internet to find out if anyone else has ever witnessed a shadow person and a living person working together, or at least get some theories as to what happened that night. A couple of nights later, we thought we saw the shadow thing once more, but it didn't have a human shape that time, so I'm not sure if it was the same entity or not. The timing seemed too coincidental. Please let me know what that was. When I was 21, I met this man named Tony on Tinder. We hit it off right away when I responded to a meme he sent that made me crack up in the middle of work. We spent days texting, and things seemed to be going well. We talked about our interests, and he managed to name most of the bands I adored. He sent me pictures of his dog, and we had deeper conversations that felt more than just surface level. Personally, I'm very cautious around new people, but Tony didn't feel new at all. It felt like we were long-lost friends. That's why when he asked to take me out on an actual date, that Friday on the 4th of July, I answered instantly. Leading up to the date, I was ecstatic. I went out the Wednesday before and put together a brand new outfit. We were supposed to go to dinner and fireworks display afterward. In response to it being a holiday event, I bought a red romper and a pair of white wedge sandals. Up until the day before the date, we spent almost every day talking. If we weren't texting, he would call. The way Tony described his life seemed picturesque to me. He claimed he traveled a lot for work and was close to his family. Well, the day of the date rolls around and I'm getting ready, curling my hair and fixing my makeup. It's 45 minutes before we were supposed to be at our reservation, and there's a knock on my door. I thought I was imagining things, but I heard it once again, just louder. Annoyed, I walked down to see who it was, and when I opened the door, there was Tony. I just stared and blinked slowly. I tried to recount the messages to see if I'd even sent him my address by that point. I didn't remember doing so, but I thought I might have forgotten. Sure, it was weird, but okay. I pointed out that it was early, and he made some excuse about just wanting to catch up and get to know each other more. I just agreed, and he sat on the couch while I put on the finishing touches. But when I came back out to the living room, he wasn't on the couch. I looked around until I found him in the kitchen pouring wine. Wine that I had bought earlier and left untouched in the fridge. I tried to hide my annoyance because I'm not a fan of people touching my things without permission, but I wanted to remain an amicable host. We sat back down and started chatting about mundane things, the kind you would normally expect on a first date. I had this nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, though. Tony looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. My brain kept trying to figure it out every time I made eye contact. He told me about traveling for work and how his mom was terminally ill, but they were all incredibly close. The way he described it, his parents were his heroes, and he often spent time helping take care of his mom when he wasn't traveling. Part of me was in awe because it seemed like such a sweet thing to do. I was raised to watch how a man treats his mother, because it reflects how he'll treat you. I explained my background, and he'd often interrupt, scoff at something that had happened, or try to empathize with me. When we left for dinner, I felt calmer around him. Sure, it was weird how forward he was with new people, but he seemed sweet enough. At dinner, he walked side by side with me, with a hand on the small of my back until we came to the door. Then he stepped in front and held it open for me. I gave a nod, and we went to a booth where we sat across from each other. We talked over wine and drinks, bantering. He switched to literature loves, and I melted. I had loved reading and writing my whole life, so this was a topic that I instantly latched onto. He mentioned how he would write poetry sometimes, and wanted to be a journalist growing up. I found myself growing more into him with each sentence. While waiting for our main course, he put his hand on top of mine that was on the table. Then things started to get a little too weird for my taste. It went from casual first date butterflies to something that felt unnatural. His stare felt too intense for a first date. He made a remark about how he didn't know how my most recent ex could ever do to me what he did. I was shocked. I had talked about ex-boyfriends, but never my most recent ex. I didn't speak about him because I hated him. He was an awful person, and our relationship was something I didn't like to remember. Even my friends knew it was a taboo topic. He must have sensed my apprehension because he backpedaled, trying to explain that he meant the one I told him about, and that if I was single now, obviously I had been wronged. The assumption annoyed me more because, on the contrary, while I didn't speak to most of my exes, I definitely didn't hate them all. Some of them just didn't work out, and we remained friends. I swallowed the anxiety and tried to take him at his word once again. After all, I thought maybe I was just being too cynical. We finished our dinner and dessert without any more ex talk, and instead switched to hobbies. We laughed over awful hiking trips, and I told him about nearly breaking my arm at Walls of Jericho. It was fun. Then we made our way to the show, and I could no longer hide my discomfort, even if I tried my hardest. During the drive, he turned the radio onto an old 2000s pop-punk band that nobody else seemed to know existed. It was such an odd change because I hadn't listened to them in years either. He spoke of seeing them live one time, which was weird because I did too. They only came to my town once, and he was apparently there at the same show, same time. It made sense, seeing that I thought he looked familiar. And the song choice was creepy. He spoke about being in love with someone for years before they finally noticed the singer's existence. Basically a creepy, stalkerish love ballad. I felt his hand slowly sneak to my knee, lightly clasping his fingers around it. Not in a full-on grip, but enough that I felt the tips of his fingers digging in. His thumb was doing the weird circle thing, and I was not having a good time. I wiggled my leg a bit to try to move and shifted, but once I settled back in, his hand moved right back. I was watching the road, just wishing we would get there already, but he was in no hurry. It felt purposeful how slow he was going. He blamed potential roadblocks, but there weren't any, not until later. The songs kept shuffling, one by one, and each one of them was a love song or a heartbreak song. One song felt purposeful. I love a good emotional ballad, but this was just too much emotion for a first date. I felt the breath I had been holding release when he pulled into a parking lot spot and his hand moved. I hurried to open my own door and stepped out, fixing my romper. I tried to sit far enough back so that I figured constant contact would be difficult, but when he sat down too, he went right back to the constant touching. He started talking to me and out of the blue, asked if I wanted kids of my own or a big or small wedding. I audibly choked on my own spit. I thought over my response and, instead of answering, just told him that I didn't know all of that yet and we just met, so we could focus on other things like the show. He just would not take the hint. Apparently, he wanted to name his son William and a daughter Lolo. I never replied to give my input and instead focused harder on the fireworks, as if my thoughts were causing them to explode. Right before the finale, he laced his fingers through mine and brought my hand to his mouth, placing kisses on my knuckles. I turned to look at him, trying to discern what in the world he was doing, but he assumed it was just a loving look when it was not. This man proceeded to give what felt a few sentences short of a speech. I knew I loved you from the very first time I laid eyes on you. Back then you didn't see me, but I couldn't stop thinking about you. Meeting you now, I'm even more head over heels in love with you, and I can't wait to see where our future takes us. Being here with you right now makes me the happiest I've ever been. My brain was just trying to catch up with the words he had just spoken, and in the heat of the moment, my mouth spoke before my brain could stop it. I very calmly said, "Well, this is fun. but my future is taking me home now." The look on his face was sheer devastation. He started to sob right there. I didn't even have words to try to console him. He was groveling, saying he would slow it down and we could move at my pace, but I was already up and walking toward the restroom a few yards ahead. Nothing I would say was going to make this better, so I called a friend of mine to come pick me up. We had a code word for these kinds of things. I hid in that bathroom for what felt like centuries. When she got there, she had to walk into the bathroom past Tony, who was sitting outside the door. He was still crying. She walked in, got me, put her arm around me, and walked us out together. I didn't even look at him. I ended up staying at her house that night, and the next morning, I woke up to 50 texts and 15 calls. Instead of blocking the number, I called my service provider and changed my number entirely. I blocked him on literally everything, down to Cash App and Venmo. I wasn't taking any chances. Needless to say, after that experience, I stayed off dating apps. I still haven't been back. Instead, I met my current partner through the best friend who rescued me that night. I don't know whatever happened to Tony. After a few months, I stopped being curious. I don't even know if the first time he met me was at the weird pop punk show or before. It was just all around not a fun time.